They came at dawn, and not a single man in town could explain why 30 Apache riders would stop in silence outside one forgotten ranch. But Elias Whitmore knew. Even before he stepped onto the porch, even before the dust settled around their horses' hooves, even before his eyes found hers standing at the center of them all. Because some things a man doesn't forget. No matter how many winters pass or how many miles of empty land he puts between himself and the truth. And as the morning light stretched across the dry earth, turning everything gold and still, the kind of stillness that feels like the world is holding its breath, Elias rested one hand on the porch rail, not reaching for the rifle by the door, not calling out, just watching. Because out here, silence always meant something. And this kind of silence meant everything. The riders didn't move, didn't speak. Their horses barely shifting under them like they understood this moment carried weight beyond any ordinary visit. And then there was her, sitting straight in the saddle, not dressed like someone lost or broken anymore. Not the woman he remembered pulling from the edge of death, but someone else entirely, someone the others watched without looking directly at, the kind of respect that doesn't need to be spoken. And Elias felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, not quite regret, something older than both. Something that had been waiting for this exact moment whether he wanted it or not. Because years ago, on a night when the sky split open with rain and the wind howled like it was trying to tear the land apart, he had made a choice no man in his position was supposed to make. And now that choice had come riding back to his door. The boards beneath his boots creaked softly as he took one slow step forward. Enough for the dust to catch the light between him and them. Enough for the town behind him to start noticing. Because people always notice when something doesn't belong, and 30 silent. Riders on a ranch that hadn't seen visitors in months didn't belong. A few figures gathered at the far edge of the road, watching from a distance, whispering things they didn't understand, and Elias could almost hear the words forming before they were spoken. Trouble, debt, revenge. Those were the only explanations men like them knew. But this wasn't that. This was something quieter, heavier, something that didn't need guns or raised voices to make itself known. The woman's gaze stayed on him, steady, unblinking, like she had crossed miles of open land for this one moment, and nothing else mattered. And for a brief second, the years between them disappeared, leaving only the memory of cold rain, blood on his hands, and a door he had chosen to open instead of close. And now here she was again, not asking, not explaining, just standing there with 30 warriors behind her and a silence that pressed against the air like a coming storm. And Elias Whitmore, a man who had spent years learning how to live with what he'd done, realized something simple and unavoidable. Whatever had been set in motion that night had never really ended. The town did not move closer, but it did not leave either. Because men who have lived long enough on hard land learn to recognize when something is about to be decided without them. And Elias could feel their eyes on his back as clearly as the morning sun warming the dust at his feet. But he did not turn. He did not acknowledge them. Because whatever stood in front of him now belonged to a different kind of reckoning. One that had started years before any of them even knew his name. And as he looked at the woman again, really looked this time, he saw what had changed and what had not. The same steady eyes that once held fear now held something else entirely, something measured, something that did not need to prove itself. And it stirred a memory he had tried to bury under seasons of quiet routine, days spent fixing fences, nights spent alone with nothing but wind and thought. A life built carefully to avoid the kind of choices that leave marks a man cannot wash away, but memory does. Not ask for permission. It comes when it chooses, and it comes whole. And suddenly he was back in that night without needing to close his eyes, the sky heavy with rain, the sound of something moving fast through the dark, not an animal, not the wind, something human and desperate. And he remembered standing in his barn doorway, lantern in hand, the light cutting a narrow path through the storm, just enough to see her collapse into it, soaked, shaking, barely able to stand. And for a moment, just a moment, he had considered stepping back, closing the door, letting the storm take care of what it always does out here, because that would have been the safer choice, the quieter choice, the kind of choice that keeps a man out of trouble. But there was something in the way she looked at him, not asking, not begging, just holding on to the last bit of strength she had left, and it forced a question he had spent years avoiding. What kind of man walks away when no one is watching? And the answer had come before he could think it through. He stepped aside. He let her in. And that single step had drawn a line between the life he knew and the one he would never fully escape. Because not long after, the riders came, 5 of them, their silhouettes, cutting through the rain, their voices carrying across the yard with the kind of certainty that assumes obedience, asking questions that were not really questions, expecting answers that would make things simple again. And Elias had stood there, between them and the truth behind his door, feeling the weight of a decision that could not be undone. And he had chosen silence, not out of defiance, not out of courage, but because something in him refused to hand over a life he had already decided to protect. And when the riders finally left, taking their questions and their certainty with them, the storm did not feel any lighter, because he knew that what he had done would not stay buried forever. And now, standing on his porch with 30 riders in front of him and the same woman at their center, he understood something he had not allowed himself to consider until this moment. That night had not been an ending. It had been the beginning of something that had been moving toward him ever since, slow, steady, and inevitable as the sunrise now stretching across the land. The memory did not stop where he wished it would, because once a man begins to remember the truth, it does not come in pieces. It comes complete, and Elias could see every detail of that night as clearly as the riders in front of him now. The way the woman had leaned against the rough wood inside his barn, her breath shallow but steady, her hands clutching something close to her chest as if it mattered more than the pain she carried. And he had kept his distance at first, not out of fear, but out of respect for something he did not yet understand, because out here, a stranger's silence often spoke louder than their words, and hers had said enough. She was not running blindly. She was running with purpose, and that alone made her different from the kind of trouble men usually try to avoid. He remembered setting the lantern down, the light flickering across the walls, casting long shadows that made everything feel uncertain, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Just the sound of rain on the roof and the quiet tension of 2 lives crossing in a place neither of them had planned to be, until finally she looked at him, not with fear this time, but with something steadier, something that asked for nothing yet demanded everything at the same time. And when she spoke, her voice had been low, careful, shaped by a language that was not fully his, but clear enough to carry meaning. She said only what was necessary, that she needed a place to stay until the night passed, that she would be gone before morning, that no trouble would follow if he chose not to ask questions. And Elias had understood then that whatever story lay behind her was larger than anything she could explain in a few words, and he had made another choice, quieter than the first, but just as final. He nodded, stepped back, and gave her space without pressing for answers, because sometimes the strongest thing a man can offer is not control, but restraint. And the hours that followed moved slowly, marked only by the shifting of light and the fading of the storm outside. He had kept watch from the doorway, listening for the riders he knew would return, measuring the distance between what he had done and what it might cost him. While inside, she rested without fully sleeping, always aware, always ready, as if even in stillness she carried the weight of something unfinished. And just before the sky began to lighten, when the world sits in that quiet space between night and day, she rose, steadier now, her strength returning not all at once but enough, and she stepped toward him with something small in her hand, a turquoise pendant tied to a worn leather cord, simple at a glance but holding a kind of presence that made him pause, and she placed it in his palm without explanation, her fingers lingering only long enough for him to feel that it was not a gift in the way most men understand gifts. It was something else, something closer to a promise or a mark left behind. And then she met his eyes one last time. And in that look there was gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, something he had not known how to read then and could not ignore now. As if she already understood that this moment would not stay buried, that it would return when the time was right. And without another word, she turned and disappeared into the fading dark, leaving Elias standing there with the pendant in his hand, and the quiet certainty that whatever path she walked would one day circle back to him. And now, years later, as the morning sun rose over 30 waiting riders, and the same woman stood before him changed but unmistakable, Elias tightened his grip on the memory he had tried to forget, because he could finally see it clearly. That night had not been about saving a stranger. It had been about stepping into something larger than himself, something that had been moving toward this exact moment all along. The present did not rush forward. It pressed in slowly, the kind of pressure that builds without sound until a man realizes he is already standing in the middle of it. And Elias could feel it now in the way the air seemed heavier than it should be, in the way even the horses held still as if they understood that whatever happened next did not belong to ordinary moments. And somewhere behind him a board creaked under a cautious step. One of the townsmen drawing just a little closer, not brave enough to speak, not foolish enough to leave, because curiosity and fear often ride side by side out here, but Elias did not turn. He kept his eyes on her, because she had not moved either, not yet, and that stillness carried more meaning than any words could have. It was not hesitation, it was control, the kind that comes from knowing exactly when to act and when to wait. And that realization settled into him with a quiet weight. This was no longer about the past alone. This was about what that past had become. The years between then and now had shaped her into something he had not been there to witness. Something the riders behind her already understood, and he could see it in the way they sat, not guarding her, not escorting her, but following, a subtle difference that only a man who has lived around animals and people long enough would recognize. And it told him more than any introduction could have. The distance between them was no more than 20 yards, close enough to speak without raising a voice, far enough that each step would matter. And for a moment, no one took it, because moments like this do not belong to haste, they belong to decision. And Elias felt the old instinct stir again, the same one that had guided him that night in the barn, the instinct to choose before fear has a chance to settle in. And so he stepped down from the porch, one slow step, then another, boots meeting dry earth with a quiet finality, and the movement rippled through the space between them, not as alarm, but as acknowledgement. The riders did not reach for anything, did not shift in warning. They simply watched, and that told him he had not made the wrong move. Not yet. He stopped a few feet closer, enough that the sunlight no longer cut between them, enough that he could see the details the years had changed, the steadiness in her posture, the calm in her breathing, the way her hands rested without tension, as if she carried no need to defend herself, and yet everything about her suggested she could, if she chose to. And that quiet confidence struck him harder than any threat could have, because it left no room for misunderstanding. She was here by choice, not by chance, and finally, after all the waiting, she moved, just enough to shift her weight as she swung one leg over and stepped down from her horse. The motion smooth, unhurried, practiced, and the moment her boots touched the ground, something unseen seemed to settle into place, like a piece of a story sliding into its proper position. She did not approach immediately, did not close the distance all at once. Instead, she walked forward a few steps and stopped, leaving that last space between them untouched, a space that now held every year, every choice, every consequence that had led them back to this point. And for the first time since the riders had arrived, Elias noticed something he had missed before, a familiar shape resting against her chest, hanging from a leather cord that caught the light just enough to draw his eye. Turquoise, worn smooth with time, and the breath he had not realized he was holding left him slowly, because he knew then, without needing to ask, that she had carried it all these years, just as he had carried the memory of it. And in that small, quiet detail, the past and present finally met without distance, and everything that had been left unsaid between them now stood waiting to be understood. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and it was not the kind of silence that comes from uncertainty. It was the kind that comes when two people already understand more than words could carry, and Elias felt it settle between them like dust after a long ride, steady, undeniable, and heavier than anything he had faced in years. His eyes remained on the pendant resting against her chest, the same turquoise stone he had once held in his palm under a leaking roof while rain pounded against the boards. And now it seemed different somehow, not because it had changed, but because he finally understood that he had never really seen it for what it was. And she noticed his gaze, of course she did, and without a word she reached up, her fingers closing around the cord, lifting it just enough for the stone to catch the morning light. And in that small motion there was no hesitation, no question, only a quiet certainty. as if she had been waiting for him to recognize it. And maybe she had. Maybe this entire journey had been built on that single moment of recognition. She stepped forward then, closing the last few feet between them. Not quickly, not cautiously, just with the same measured pace that had defined everything about her presence. And when she stopped, they stood close enough now that Elias could see the faint lines time had drawn at the corners of her eyes, not from hardship alone, but from years lived with purpose. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried low and even, shaped by distance and time, but still unmistakably hers. "You kept it," she said, and it was not a question, not really, because she already knew the answer, and Elias let out a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding, his hand moving almost on its own to the inside of his coat, fingers brushing against something he had carried longer than he cared to admit. And for a second he hesitated, not because he doubted the moment, but because bringing it into the light meant accepting everything that came with it. And then he drew it out, the same pendant, worn, familiar. The leather cord replaced but the stone unchanged, and he held it out between them, not offering it back, not claiming it as his own, just letting it exist there in the space they shared. And something shifted then, subtle but real, like a door opening somewhere unseen, because this was no longer about memory. It was about truth, and she looked at it, not with surprise, not with relief, but with a quiet acknowledgement that what had been set in motion years ago had held its course. And then she reached out, not to take it, but to touch it lightly, her fingers brushing the stone in his hand. And in that contact, there was something deeper than gratitude, something that carried weight beyond the two of them. And when she spoke again, her words were just as measured as before. "That night," she said, pausing just long enough for the past to settle fully between them, "you chose to see me when others would not." And Elias felt the truth of that settle into him, not as pride, not as regret, but as something simpler, something final, because he had never thought of it that way, never allowed himself to give that moment a name. And yet here it was, being returned to him not as a memory, but as meaning. And behind her, the riders remained still, watching without interference, as if they understood that whatever was happening here did not belong to them to interrupt. And for the first time since they had arrived, Elias realized that this was not a confrontation, not a reckoning in the way the town behind him feared. This was something else entirely, something that had been carried across years and miles to reach this exact point. And as the morning light grew stronger, casting longer shadows across the ground, he understood that whatever came next would not be decided by force or fear, but by the truth they were finally ready to face. She let her hand fall away from the pendant, but the meaning of that touch lingered in the air like the last note of a song that refuses to fade. And Elias felt it settle deeper than anything she had said so far, because this was no longer about what had happened. It was about what it had become, and before he could find words that felt equal to that weight, she spoke again, her voice still calm, still measured, but carrying something new beneath it, something that did not belong to memory but to the present standing between them. "You thought you were hiding me," she said, her eyes steady on his. "But you were standing in front of something you could not see yet." And Elias felt a quiet shift inside him, the kind that comes when a truth begins to take shape without fully revealing itself. And behind her, one of the riders moved for the first time, not forward, not in warning, but simply adjusting in the saddle as if acknowledging that the moment had reached a point where silence alone could no longer carry it. And still, none of them spoke, because whatever was unfolding here belonged to her to say. And she did not rush it. She let the space hold for a few seconds longer, letting him feel the distance between what he believed that night and what it had meant beyond his knowing. And then she reached up once more, not to lift the pendant this time, but to rest her hand against it, as if grounding herself in something older than both of them. And when she spoke again, her words came slower, deliberate, each one placed with care. "The men who were looking for me, they were not looking for a woman," she said, and Elias felt his breath tighten just slightly, because that single sentence carried more weight than anything that had come before. It turned the memory he had held for years into something incomplete, something he had misunderstood at its core. And she continued, her gaze never leaving his. "They were looking for a name, and there it was, the word that had been waiting beneath everything, not spoken yet. but already changing the ground beneath his feet. And Elias understood then that the pendant, the silence, the years that had passed, none of it had been random. It had all been part of something tied to that name, something that had followed her long before she reached his door and had now brought her back to it. And for the first time since she arrived, he felt something close to uncertainty, not fear, but the realization that the story he thought he knew had only ever been half of the truth. And she saw it. Of course she did. The way his expression shifted, the way his shoulders held just a little more tension, and there was no satisfaction in her eyes, no sense of proving something over him, only a quiet understanding, as if she had expected this moment and accepted it long before he had. And then she took one final step closer, closing even the smallest distance that remained, and lowered her voice just enough that it belonged only to him, even though everyone could still hear it. And if they had found that name that night, she said, this land would not have stayed as quiet as it has. And the words did not need to explain further. They did not need to describe what might have followed, because Elias could feel it in the way the riders behind her remained still, not as a threat, but as a reminder of what existed beyond his small stretch of land, beyond the fences and the routines he had built his life around. And suddenly the weight of that night shifted again. No longer just a choice to help someone in need, but a moment that had stood at the edge of something much larger, something he had never been meant to understand until now. And as the sun rose higher, casting clearer light across all of them, Elias Whitmore realized that the question was no longer what he had done back then, but what that act had prevented, and why she had come back now to tell him. The word lingered between them, not yet spoken but already shaping everything around it. And Elias felt it in the way the ground beneath his boots seemed less certain than it had a moment before, because a name is never just a name out here. It carries weight, history, consequence. And as he looked at her, truly looked, he realized that whatever she was about to say would not just explain the past, it would redefine it. And she did not rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch just long enough for him to feel the gravity of what was coming, the kind of pause that turns listening into something deeper than hearing. And then she spoke, her voice steady, clear, carrying across the still air without effort. Nayeli of the Red Mesa, she said, and the name settled into the space like something that had always belonged there. And behind her, the riders lowered their gaze not in submission, but in recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of something greater than themselves. And Elias felt it immediately, not because he understood the title fully, but because he recognized what it meant in the way men respond to it, the kind of respect that cannot be demanded, only carried. And in that moment, the woman he had hidden in his barn was no longer just a memory. She stood before him as someone whose life had been tied to far more than survival. And the realization came slow, deliberate, like dawn breaking across a long horizon, that the night he had chosen to protect her, he had not been protecting a stranger. He had been standing between forces he had never even known existed. And she watched him take that in, not with impatience, not with expectation, but with the same calm certainty that had defined her since she arrived, as if she understood that truth does not need to be forced, it only needs to be given time to settle. And when she spoke again, her voice softened slightly, not in weakness, but in something closer to acknowledgement. My father carried that name before me, she said, and for a brief moment, something passed through her eyes, not sorrow, not pride, something quieter, something that belonged to memory rather than loss. And the men who were searching that night, they were not searching for me alone. And Elias felt the final piece begin to fall into place, the shape of it becoming clearer with each word, because now it was not just about her. It was about what she represented, what her name carried beyond herself. And he understood then why the riders had come, why they stood without threat, why the town behind him could not make sense of it. This was not a visit driven by anger or debt. It was something older, something rooted in meaning rather than reaction. And she took one small step back, not creating distance, but allowing the space between them to breathe again, as if the truth she had just spoken needed room to exist on its own. And Elias felt his grip tighten slightly around the pendant in his hand, not out of tension, but out of recognition, because that small piece of stone had never just been a token. It had been a marker, a connection between a moment he thought was fleeting and a story that had continued long after he let her walk away. And now, standing in the full light of morning with her name spoken aloud and its meaning settling into every silent observer around them. Elias Whitmore understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The choice he had made that night had not simply changed her path. It had intersected with something far greater, something that carried forward through years and distance, and had now returned not to question him, not to judge him, but to reveal what he had unknowingly stood in the middle of all along. The name did not echo. It settled, heavy and quiet, and with it came a shift that no one in the town behind Elias could fully understand, because they heard only a name, but the riders heard something else, something that carried history, duty, and the weight of decisions that stretched far beyond a single morning. And Elias stood there holding that weight without ever having asked for it, his hand still wrapped around the pendant, his eyes steady on Nayeli. As the meaning of her words continued to unfold, not all at once, but piece by piece, the way truth always does when it has been waiting a long time to be seen, and she watched him with a calm that did not demand anything from him, did not expect gratitude or apology, only recognition. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that same measured tone, but now there was something deeper beneath it, something closer to conclusion than revelation. If they had found me that night, she said, they would not have stopped at me. And Elias felt the implication before she finished, not in images or fear, but in the quiet understanding that what had been avoided could not be measured in simple terms. And she continued, they were not just searching for a name to take, they were searching for a reason. And the words settled into him slowly, because a reason is what men build everything on, reasons to claim land, to draw lines, to decide who belongs and who does not. And in that moment, Elias understood that the night he had opened his door, he had stepped into something that had already been moving long before he ever heard the sound of her footsteps in the storm, and that by choosing not to hand her over, he had removed something those men needed, something they had been prepared to use. And Nayeli saw that understanding reach him, saw the way his shoulders eased just slightly, not from relief, but from clarity. And she gave a small nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement, as if confirming that he had finally seen the truth for what it was. And then she did something none of the onlookers expected, something so simple it almost went unnoticed at first. She reached out and gently closed his fingers around the pendant in his hand, not taking it back, not reclaiming it as something that belonged to her, but returning it to him fully, placing it where it had always belonged since that night. And her voice softened just enough to carry only to him, even though every man present leaned in without realizing it. You did not save me, she said, and the words hung there for a brief second, almost contradicting everything that had been building. But then she finished. You gave something time to become what it was meant to be. And Elias felt that settled deeper than anything before it, because it stripped away the idea of hero or savior, left only the truth of a choice made without knowing its reach. And for the first time since the riders arrived, he let out a slow breath that carried years with it, not because the moment was over, but because it had finally found its meaning. And behind Nayeli, one by one, the riders shifted, not in preparation for conflict, but in something quieter, something closer to respect being made visible, their posture changing just enough to signal that whatever purpose had brought them here had been fulfilled. And the town behind Elias stood frozen in place, unable to read what they were seeing, because there were no raised voices, no signs they understood as resolution, only silence. And in that silence, something far more powerful had already taken place. And as Nayeli stepped back, giving the space between them back to the morning light, Elias Whitmore understood with a clarity that would stay with him long after they were gone, that the most important things a man does are often the ones he never realizes he has done at all. For a long time after her words settled, nothing moved. Not the riders, not the men watching from the road, not even the wind that usually found its way across the open land by mid-morning. And Elias stood there with the pendant closed in his hand, feeling its weight in a way he never had before, not as an object, but as a reminder of something that had passed through him and kept going. Something that had grown beyond his understanding and returned only when it no longer needed anything from him. And Nayeli held his gaze for one final moment, not searching for approval, not offering gratitude, just sharing the quiet certainty that what had needed to be said had already been spoken. And then she gave the smallest nod, a gesture so simple it could have been missed by anyone who did not understand what it carried, and turned back toward her horse, the movement smooth, unhurried, as if she were stepping out of a moment that had reached its natural end, and the riders responded without command, without signal, each one shifting with the same quiet discipline that had defined them since they arrived. And as she mounted, the line began to move, not in a rush, not in retreat, but in the steady rhythm of people who had come with purpose and were now leaving with it fulfilled, and no one tried to stop them, not the men in town, not Elias, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to demand. And as they rode away, the sound of hooves against the dry earth returned slowly, like the world remembering how to move again, fading into the distance until it became part of the land once more, and the silence they left behind was not empty. It was full, filled with something that did not need to be named to be understood, and Elias remained where he was, long after they disappeared beyond the rise, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hand still closed around the pendant. And only when the last trace of dust settled did he finally exhale, a slow, steady breath that carried the weight of years with it. And behind him, the townsmen began to shift, murmurs rising, questions forming, but none of them found their way to him. Because there are moments a man does not explain, not because he cannot, but because explanation would only make them smaller than they truly are. And Elias turned back toward his porch, his steps unhurried, the same as they had been before the riders arrived. But something in him had changed in a way that would not be seen from the outside, not in how he walked, not in how he worked, but in how he understood the quiet choices that shape a life. And as he reached the door, he paused for just a second, looking out once more across the land that had remained unchanged while everything else had moved beneath it. And he slipped the pendant back inside his coat, not as something to remember, but as something that no longer needed remembering, because its meaning had already been lived, and somewhere far beyond his sight. A woman carried a name that had been allowed to become what it was meant to be, and a man who had once opened a door in the rain stood alone again, not waiting, not wondering, simply knowing that out here, the kind of justice that matters most does not arrive with noise or force. It arrives quietly, and leaves the same way, carried only in the weight a man chooses to bear without ever needing to speak of it.